estamos. Bueno, buenas tardes. Mis disculpas por el ligero retraso. Nos encontramos entonces acá desde el auditorio Roberto Murillo de la Facultad de Letras para la conferencia del profesor Peter Erving Jansen, que nos ha preparado una conferencia sobre el tema de Herbert Marcuse y Leo Löwenthal, la amistad como utopía redentora. El profesor Jansen es el responsable del archivo de Leo Löwenthal y además ha estado a cargo de la edición de varias de las obras inéditas de Herbert Marcuse, y pues bueno, va entonces a compartir con nosotros la conferencia a partir de un artículo que escribió junto con la doctora Inka Engel. Entonces vamos a hacer la siguiente dinámica. El profesor va a dar la conferencia en inglés y estaremos compartiendo en la pantalla la traducción que se ha realizado de esta conferencia en español. Entonces, por favor. Ups. Necesito compartir. No puedo compartir. Ahora sí, muchas gracias. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here to the University in San Jose in Costa Rica. I'm very happy to be here with my colleague Inka Engel, with whom I wrote this article, this lecture. You will hear now in English, and George Garcia was so kind to translate it into Spanish, so you can follow my lecture in Spanish, and people who are able to listen in the English version, then you can follow me on my English text. So, like George Garcia mentioned it before, I am responsible for the archives of Herbert Marcuse and Leo Löwenthal in Frankfurt, and my lecture has the title Leo Löwenthal and Herbert Marcuse, Friendship as a Saving Utopia. This friendship as a saving utopia, that means that most of the Frankfurt School people, the scientists of the Frankfurt School, had to leave Germany in 1933, and they find exile in the US. Some of you will know that. And Herbert Marcuse and Leo Löwenthal had a long life friendship, and that is the reason why my paper has this title, Friendship as a Saving Utopia. Herbert Marcuse, born in 1898, and Leo Löwenthal, who was 2 years younger, met for the first time in Frankfurt in 1932. Horkheimer had commissioned Löwenthal to make contact with Herbert Marcuse through Kurt Ritzler, the rector of the University of Frankfurt. Marcuse, who had wanted to habilitate under Martin Heidegger in Freiburg in 1932, but was unable to do so, was looking for a new field of academic activity. Heidegger had allowed himself to be appointed rector of Freiburg University under the Slavistica of the Nazi system. This and an exchange of letters between Martin Heidegger and Herbert Marcuse from 1947 and 1948 led to a final rift between the former teacher Heidegger and the Hegel Marxist Herbert Marcuse. Leo Löwenthal ensured that Marcuse, against Adorno's reservations, officially joined the Institute in January 1933, just on the day when Hitler came to power. From Freiburg via Geneva, Marcuse then went into exile in New York in 1934. The friendship between the beast Löwenthal and the monster Marcuse, that are two issues on the letters, Beast Löwenthal and the Monster Marcuse, as addressed in the first letters, now published in a selection in the volume, and the German title is Über Herbert den Greisen und Leo den Weisen. The English title on Herbert the Old Man and Leo the Wise Man. It just appeared in July this year. And it testifies this friendship for over 45 years. In a first step, this article, this lecture, presents an overview of Herbert Marcuse's estate volumes, which have been compiled according to thematic foci and from numerous unpublished documents from the Herbert Marcuse archive of the Frankfurt University Library. In a second step, the study on the authoritarian character, consisting of 5 volumes, is briefly discussed in this paper. The focus is on the last volume of the study by Leo Löwenthal and Norbert Gutermann. He was a friend of Leo Löwenthal, which was published under the title The Prophet of Deceits in 1949. This is followed by a focus on Herbert Marcuse's enemy analysis, which he produced while working at the Office of Strategic Services between 1941 and 1947. The article concludes with a reflection on Leo Löwenthal's individual and terror, which was written under the impression of testimonies under the barbaric crimes of National Socialism. I need to scroll. Marcuse's, I will give you an overview first about this, this collection of the volumes from the Marcuse archive. Marcuse's thematic emphasis in the volumes of his estate. In the first volume, one of the called The Fate of Bourgeoisie Democracy, Oskar Nägg, the German sociologist, explains Marcuse's dialectical understanding of democracy against the background of a collapsing US-American democracy. The deeper Marcuse stretches at the capitalist democratic surface, the clearer the revealing mechanisms of systems of domination become. His analysis of the problem of a subjectivity opened up the perspective of the solution he addresses in another title, in another article called in German Triebstruktur und Gesellschaft. The approach of breaking up the psychophysical correspondence between rulers and ruled, such as ideological appropriation and mental exploitation, both predisposed in the Triebstruktur, becomes the central theme of the theoretical practical studies, and it began in 1941. Which aim of an autonomy of the subjects in the context of a society of free people, free of domination. Marcuse's thinking was a penetration into microstructures, the reveal of the essential only after the veil of political, social, and societal structures has been lifted. The method was generated from an idiosyncratic combination of Heidegger's ontology of existence, a left-wing Hegelian Marxism, a Freudian tribe theory, and the social psychological analysis developed in critical theory, which always excluded the oppositional side, which Oskar Nägg called it. In volume 2, Art and Liberation, all essays except Art and Politics in the Totalitarian Age are published for the first time in Germany. They show the other Marcuse, theorists who uses idealistic, aesthetic, and classical values of beauty to locate sensual liberation in recipients and artists alike. His idealistic understanding of art appears as the transcendence of Schopenhauer's aesthetic pleasure, which contains negation within itself. The artist let us look at the world through his eyes. Marcuse's artistic gaze divorced beauty and negation from cultural capitalism and the promise of happiness, as will be seen in his critique of Andy Warhol's pop art sellout. He did not define art, but positioned it within a social framework devoid of domination. Art refuses all stillness. It does not bow to the constraints of politics. The third volume, Philosophy and Psychoanalysis, comprised writings and lectures on his interpretation of Freudian psychoanalysis and on his psychological view of society. Available for the first time in German, titled Introductory Studies on Marcuse's, I must scroll again, Political Decifying of Psychoanalysis by Alfred Schmidt, a very famous Marxist in Germany, in Frankfurt, a connoisseur of critical theory, enables Marcuse to be placed in a philosophical historical frameworks and provides insight into his philosophy of history, which both emerged from the Freud's drive theory and is inspired by Marx. Schmidt points of Marcuse's concern with happiness and freedom in a materialist rather than a transcendental sense. It is, after all, a central aspect that the latter, in contrast to Freud, envisages the ideal of a non-repressive culture. George, I need to ask you, are we still in the Spanish translation?
Yeah, we're fine, yeah.
Okay, we are fine with that, okay. The text collected here from Marcuse's estate discuss social conflicts from a philosophical and socio-psychological perspective. In Freedom to Our Form, for example, a transcript of a radio broadcast from 1964, Marcuse criticizes the highly developed industrial society. It has a means of grand economic, political, and intellectual freedom, he argues, but is incapable of realizing it. Its forms of rule organize a system in which not only opposition and contradiction are included, but also technical progress and growing productivity are faithfully conditioned in it. Pluralism and democracy automatically change from critical to consenting institutions. The tangible liberation of the world from repression is described by Marcuse elsewhere at the end of Utopia. The central passages of the work Beyond the Principle of Reality and the political preface to the paperback edition of Eros and Civilization also remain committed to this idea. In the fourth volume, for the student movement and its aftermath, seeks to demystify the myth of the 1968 movement, to adjust the supposedly absolute position of critical theory, like Marcuse's apotheosis to the given objective circumstances, and to transparently evaluate its impact on the students' revolts. For Marcuse, at this time, the liberation of consciousness and knowledge was paramount. He denounced the extermination machinery of the US in Vietnam, which did not recognize any historical guilt for the mass destruction of the civilian population, which destroyed food and nature, and which itself had no ethics such as morality. Solidarity with the Vietnamese people was directed at the occupation of defenseless people who were supposed to survive as human beings and live their simple human existence. Marcuse's advocacy for the hopeful is objectified in his legendary lecture, The End of Utopia, at the Free University. See, it was another paper from 2002. Marcuse's utopian subversiveness exploded the trauma of coming to terms with the past imposed by Germany, which seemed to be trapped in a historical continuum. And the event that put an abrupt end to Marcuse's intentions on the utopia of a new society in Europe and the US were the violent excess of the RAF. That was a militant organization in Germany which tried to bring back the ideas of a revolt, and they were armed, and they looked that the German system were going after the people who were in opposition. That was the idea of the RAF. It was an armed paramilitary group. Also, he distanced himself from the counter-revolution at an early stage. The militant agitations influenced the further course of the '68 movements. At the same time, as the attacks at Angela Davis was accused in the US of cooperation as well as a militant support of the Black Power movement, Marcuse demanded her immediate release. He was a keynote speaker at the 1972 Frankfurt Solidarity Congress organized for Angela Davis. In his last speech, The World of Life Instincts has summarized the central moments of his thinking. The barriers of the new philosophy or life are not destructive capitalist interplays of a productivity and repressiveness, not leftist organizations or trade of the woman student, or trade unions that cling to the reproduction of destructive progress, but the fledgling forces of the women's student and ecology movements that are making the qualitative leap of liberation. Marcuse's hope for qualitative change in society is sustained by emancipatory social movements and the character of self-organization, a revolutionary overthrow rejected out of a class consciousness. I would skip, maybe we can skip the number 5 because I came back to that in my my last paragraph. All right. So we would skip the 5th volume, and I came to the 6th volume. Okay. In this 6th volume, some articles were about ecology and social criticism. Marcuse's thesis on technology and society, presented at the Frankfurt Römerberg-Gespräche, follow on a seamlessly from the work on the Third Reich published in volume 5. Marcuse's dialectical investigation of a technology progress against the background of the Third Reich as technocracy were orientated around the question, to what extent has technical rationalization encompassed all spheres of life, even moral consciousness, been transformed into technology? The last volume of the edition also shows effects of Heidegger's being and time on the time, as well as Marcuse's attempt to work out a synthesis of phenomenological existentialism with Marx-Hegel dialectics plus historical materialism. The aim and intention was to build a concrete philosophy that could explain social conflicts like the social existence of man. Some of the texts explicitly illustrate the fruitfulness of this concern, which in the European language area is called as existentialist Marx interpretation, influenced a little bit by Jean-Paul Sartre, by Merleau-Ponty, as well as there much more the Yugoslavian practice philosophers. Marcuse recognized, grasped, and identified the potential of new revolution in the humanistic detachment of revolting students and radical emancipation, as well as civil rights movements, all of which remained hopefuls of new utopia. So that were the content of the publications and of the documents which were found in the Marcuse archive. And we have some translations into English by Douglas Kellner, and we have some other translation in Italian by Raffaele Laudani, and some in Spanish by Romero, what was his first name?
José Manuel Romero Cuevas.
Yes. So we work together pretty close to make the same translations possible in different languages. And I will come now to the main subject of the lecture, which see the analysis of the authoritarian character of the find analysis, the enemy analysis, and studies on prejudice, and the Löwenthal's works about National Socialism. The social, you must know your enemy, lying prophets and enemy analysis. The social psychological study, the authoritarian character, studies on prejudice by the Institute of Social Research is orientated toward the manifestation of fascism spreading in Europe in the 1930s. Adorno saw this as a pretty bourgeois mass movement, and based on his hypothesized that the susceptibility of fascist propaganda is less to do with political, economic, and social ideas, but that such opinions are to be understood as reactions of psychological needs. As a result, the researchers involved in the study were not only interested in uncovering authoritarian personality structures, but also in analyzing potential fascist attitudes, which also survive under non-totalitarian, which means also democratic, societal conditions, and can expose similar attitudes again under certain changes in the societies. What Adorno is addressing is a dynamic concept of personality structure that changes under specific social conditions. For it is only in the constant interrelation of social influences, biographical breaks, and group-specific orientations that individual attitudes, opinions, attitudes, and values become established. This area of one's own personality developed is sealed with the firmly established images and prejudices against an open horizon of experience, which could allow one's own changes to be a part of one's personality development, and then not perceive them as a threat, the more strongly these are steered into authoritarian paths. Adorno writes, the objective situation of the individual hardly comes into question at the origin of such irrationality. Also, the exploration of anti-Semitic stereotypes and prejudices occupies a large part of the study and was already underpinned by the initial findings of the Berkeley Group Anti-Semitism project led by Levinson and David Stanford. The study was not limited to the exploration of anti-Semitic prejudice. It examined anti-minority prejudices that condense into ideological and characterological configurations. A part of this research was Leo Löwenthal's Prophet of Deceit. Now, what is needed are those political propagandists or demagogues who address precisely these positions. How does this happen? What tricks do they use? What dispositions of their followers do they encounter in real terms? These are questions addressed in the 5th volume of the studies Prophet of Deceit, prepared by Löwenthal and Guterman, in connection with the aforementioned studies of prejudice against authoritarianism. The lying prophet, according to the authors, reduces political and social grievances or social upheavals to ethnic groups to personify the enemies. The political propagandist is not concerned with rational defining the nature of said discontent. Rather, he seeks to reinforce any disorientation that exists among his audience by blurring all rational demarcations and proposing spontaneous actions instead. End of quote. These spontaneous actions are all the more promising the clearer it is to see against which enemy the action is to be directed. The agitator mantra-like emphasis a necessary elimination of persons, but not to change in the political structure. Quote, the only way to deal with him, the enemy, is to exterminate him, not to change the system. The personification of discomfort with the prevailing conditions thus detaches itself from political criticism and rational argumentation, and thought about political and economic causes recedes completely into the background. The charges of the agitator do refer to a social reality, but not into the form of rational terms. The agitator knows how to use emotional backgrounds for his own purposes, especially in social crisis situations. He activates, plays with individual feelings of fear, which have long been part of the basic stock of life in modern capitalist societies. Löwenthal calls his human condition in contemporary existence the social malaise. From anxious to an insecure situation can become hatred to the apparent perpetrators who are supposed to be a blame for the misery. The agitator does not create the unease, but he reinforces and solidifies it because he blocks the way to overcoming the causes. In this context, the authors interpret contradictory social conditions are so sustainable, reduced to the individual experience humiliation, that only an authoritarian liberation strike can secure a victory in the struggle for survival. So we need a very strong guy who's bringing us out of this malaise. This is what the agitator promises, and he also knows how to target. This is why the description of an enemy image takes such a central place in political agitation. That is what the main content of the Löwenthal books. Of course, it's very short, but we're running out of time, I know. But so you get an overview on this main issues on Löwenthal's book. The other guy, Herbert Marcuse, wrote this enemy analysis, which were written some years earlier. As Jews and critical intellectuals, Marcuse, Löwenthal, Adorno, Horkheimer, Franz Neumann, and other staff members of the Institute for Social Research, founded in Frankfurt in 1924, with the financial support of Felix Weil, were forced to flee and go into exile by the Nazis in 1933. Columbia University in New York was the first stop in the States. The staff of the Institute for Social Research in New York were forced to look for new employment opportunities in American work contexts. In the late 1930s, due to dwindling funds, Horkheimer and Adorno left New York. In 1940 for Los Angeles on the West Coast. There they begin their collaborative work, Dialectic of Enlightenment. More precisely, the work on elements of anti-Semitism. By the way, Leo Löwenthal was writing with them this piece, Element of Anti-Semitism. Disappointed that Marcuse could not stay close to the authors of the Dialectic of Enlightenment in California, Marcuse went to Washington in the late 1930s, where Franz Neumann was already working on the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. There, Marcuse, mediated by Löwenthal, first took a position in the Office of War Information, then a year later in 1941 in the OSS. Together with the constitutional lawyer Franz Neumann, Marcuse wrote The State and Individual in National Socialism, which was printed in Marcuse's volume Feindanalysen on the Germans. The authors summarized, I quote, "National Socialism had two things to offer. On the one hand, a new economic security, and on the other, a new freedom of movement. For the majority of the German population, the individual freedom of the pre-fascist area was synonymous with constant social insecurity. Since 1923, there have been no attempts to establish a truly democratic society." Also, the Weimar Democratic Constitution was established in 1990, but it was never lived from the people in Germany. National Socialism transforms the free into the economically secure subject, and the dangerous ideal of freedom was replaced by the protective reality of secure existence. Enemy Analysis brings together the texts that are in the context of Marcuse's activity between 1941 and 1950 in the OSS, a subdivision of the State Department. The OSS was a research community of exiled scholars, mostly from Europe, who studied in National Socialist Germany, its ideology based on anti-Semitism, racism, and Aryanism, its propaganda, the interconnectedness of politics, economics, the military, and law, to name Franz Neumann's work, Behemoth, Structure and Praxis of the National Socialism System, 1933 to 1944, and the preparation, then execution of the systematic mass murder of Jews, Sinti and Roma, homosexuals, members of the opposition, as well as the war rhetoric and military campaigns of conquest. In the center, in the central text is called the German Mentality Memorandum on its investigation into the psychological foundations of National Socialism. And the subtitle, which is very interesting, goes on to say somewhat too optimistically, and the possibilities of its destruction on this paper was dated on June 94. So Marcuse and Neumann, they thought that the National Socialism system break down very soon, and that is the reason why they call the paper, the subtitle, the possibilities of its distractions. And they give recommendations to the State Department of the US to create a handbook and to make recommendations how to establish a new democratic system in West Germany. The possibilities of destruction turn into realistic pessimism very early on the Marcuse's work. On August 16, 1944, he wrote to Horkheimer, I quote, "If we knew that with the collapse of Germany, the evil powers would be eliminated, then it would indeed to be a bright horizon that loomed before us. What we can do here in the USS to get a reasonably sensible policy going, we are doing. And at least some things seem to be penetrating the thinking and actions for the some in charge." In his dossiers, Marcuse first characterizes the mentality of the Germans by the feature of an unrestricted politicization. The National Socialists had turned down all boundary markings between private and public political spheres in society. Any demarcation between the spheres had been abolished. Education, privacy, sexuality, birth, family find their only meaning in the German Volksgemeinschaft. Along with this interweaving of the private and the political normative justification had also disappeared, but in politics and in the actions of individuals, a psychological neutrality had settled over every humanistic mode of behavior. So neutral that human suffering towards those who did not fit in the healthy body of the people was no longer perceived empathetically. Quote, "The Germans are at present proving themselves by entirely different values and standards, and they speak of language which is fundamentally different from the expressions of Western civilization, as well as from those of the former German culture. In order to launch an effective psychological and ideological offensive against National Socialism, we must study the new mentality and the new language in both." End of quote. Furthermore, Marcuse attests to the Germans' unrestricted disillusionment. The propagandist barrage, as analyzed by Löwenthal and Gutermann in 1950, would have led them to distrust any normative justification of politics. Hence, for Marcuse, the cynical objectivity, the omnipresent terror of the Nazi regime, he argues, fostered in people an attitude in which exclusively technical rational standards such as speed, skill, energy, organization, power, and efficiency were valid. Marcuse identifies as an irrational rationality the causes of the action of the National Socialist system, which were necessary for technical success and logical in themselves, and which were intended to be efficient and effective, but which in their overall result led to the elementary anti-Semitism of the final solution. I quote, "A rationality that measures everything by criteria of efficiency, success, and usefulness," end of quote, follows only one pragmatic end: the use all means successfully. Ultimately, Marcuse capitulated to the refusal of American policy to adopt the denazification recommendations. That is what I mentioned before. He left the USS, which was then replaced by the CIA on September 18th, 1947, by the Central Intelligence Act. I came now to the last part, Individual and Terror, which was written by Leo Löwenthal. His friend Leo Löwenthal interviewed survivors from the concentration camps as an American observer at this time. In 1946, under this impression, he wrote this article, Individual and Terror, which is to be understood in large parts against the background of the anti-Semitism studies and Marcuse's analysis from the second half of the 1940s. As the gruesome details of the Nazi killing machine became apparent, the world saw the Nazi terror had indeed treated human beings as inanimate objects. People have become commodities, consumer goods. From the accounts of survivors, Löwenthal interviewed on behalf of the OWI, he learned that the concrete individuals had been degraded to anonymous numbers that then disappeared in the machinery of extermination as useful on the one hand and useless commodities on the others. I quote, those who were not able to work, no, not given a number, were rejects and were destroyed. Löwenthal writes in the harrowing text, in the name of the internal enemies who had nested themselves into the healthy German body of the people as part of a gigantic Jewish world conspiracy. Nazi propaganda discredited principles such as social justice, equality of opportunity, the right to vote, equality before the law, and guarantees of the fair legal process. Freedom of the press, and thus also ideas of a democratically constituted society, such as were to be found to some extent in the Weimar Constitution, the propagandized threat of internal, external, and external enemies was the world between what the Nazis held out to the masses, both materially and psychologically, and the democratic deficits of the Weimar Constitution. For Marcuse's achievement of the National Socialists consisted precisely in interlocking the level between ideology and social reality in such a way that a kind of sober opportunism solidified as attitude in people's behavior, born by purely individual, material self-interest and an irrational rationality that shaped society, but was wielded and solidified in people's minds as a mythology that brought salvation. Last quote, long quote, the extreme objectivity with which the Germans exchanged democratic freedoms for economic security was not opposed by National Socialist mythology, but encouraged. Paradoxically, it is education in a cynical objectivity that constitutes the spirit of the mythology. In its leading concepts, it replaced social relations with natural ones, apparently more concrete and vivid. People and race are declared to be facts, for birth determined by origin and place is a fact to which class and humanity are apparently only abstract ideas. End of quote. Herbert Marcuse, never even in the midst of catastrophe in 1940, abandoned his dreamy optimism. Written at that very dark times in the paper, Is a Free Society Presently Possible? The article therefore concludes with the following little bit optimistic quote, which can be seen as his political imperative, as Marcuse's political imperative, to think emancipation. Are these, I quote, are these not merely subjectivity, value, judgments? They are based on an assumption that will never be proved, namely that people should be free. This should, though measured by positivist criteria, is not a scientific assertion, but it is a presupposition of all thought and the condition of science itself. End of quote. And thank you very much for listening. Sorry, my English was a little bit difficult today, but I hope the Spanish translation was much better than my English. Thank you very much, George, for translating.
You're welcome. Bueno, vamos entonces a atender consultas, preguntas, comentarios. por favor, si pueden, pues las formulan en español y luego en inglés. Si no fuera posible, pues en español y ahí hacemos un poco la traducción en la medida de lo posible. Todavía no aparecen preguntas. Bueno, tal vez para calentar un poco, una consulta acerca de la actualidad de la lectura que hacen Marcuse y Löwenthal. I think it's a striking the validity, the actuality of Marcuse's and Löwenthal's theory for thinking contemporary phenomena such as the rise of the extreme right in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, but as well in huge countries like Brazil, in the United States, and so on and so on. What would you think about this resurgence of this authoritarian personality in the world?
Okay. I would say the studies on authoritarian personality, it changed a little bit. I don't think that you can use this research and transfer to the actual situation.
Okay. Sí, dice el profesor que le parece que no se puede trasladar directamente este concepto de personalidad autoritaria al contexto actual. Vamos a ver por qué.
But on the other hand, Leo Löwenthal's book, A Prophet of Deceits, it shows us a lot of tricks how propaganda and demagogues and right-wing dictators try to get the people into their track. Mm-hmm. And I think this book from Leo Löwenthal is much more actual than the authoritarian character.
Ok, sí, dice que le parece que el libro de Leo Löwenthal sobre el análisis del enemigo muestra muchos de los mecanismos que se daban en aquel momento con el tema de la propaganda, etcétera, ¿verdad? Que son trucos que se utilizaban en aquel momento y que pues también actualmente se encuentran, digamos, bastante en uso, ¿verdad? O sea que hay una mayor validez, una mayor contemporaneidad del texto de Löwenthal que en el concepto de carácter autoritario de Marcuse y Adorno Horkheimer.
I will give you an argument. If the society has crisis of democracy or economic crisis, so some right-wing demagogues, they jump into this crisis, and they know, and they would say, we know who is responsible for this crisis. And it's always the same structure of arguments they use to bring the people behind her back to say that you have to vote us. Mm-hmm. And this you can find in this Prophet of Deceits. Mm-hmm. How do agitators argument in a social crisis? And that you can find there. It's still actual.
Sí, bueno, uno de estos mecanismos ejemplifica el profesor es el de que en momentos de crisis económica, o social, política más en general, estos profetas del engaño, según los denomina Löwenthal, van a decir, bueno, este es el enemigo, vote por nosotros, denos poder y nosotros vamos entonces a poder solucionar todos los problemas, ¿verdad? Puesto que se encuentran focalizados en un determinado grupo, sector social, ¿verdad? Y ese es uno de los mecanismos que señalaba Löwenthal, que indica que son muy actuales. Ok, bueno, ¿quién por ahí? No estoy viendo a alguien. No hay preguntas. ¿Ah? En el chat.
Yeah, en el chat. No.
No parece. Ok, por Facebook tal vez.
So maybe I can I can talk a little bit about the documents and
okay.
what you'll find in the archive if there are no questions.
Of course, yeah. Please.
Okay, so the first introduction of the lecture, or the first pieces of the lecture, they showed they give you an overview about the documents which are in the Marcuse archive in Frankfurt. So the documents came to Frankfurt in the early 1980s, and we have over 40,000 documents, letters, manuscripts, and so on in the archive.
80,000?
40,000 pages.
Ok, sí, bueno, nos comenta el profesor Jansen que en los años 80 se empezó a organizar el archivo de Marcuse y que en aquel momento tenían alrededor de unos 40,000 documentos, ¿verdad? De distinto tipo, cartas, borradores, pues todo tipo de textos, y que a partir de ahí pues han empezado ese trabajo hasta el día de hoy.
And it was very interesting to find, for example, the letters between Herbert Marcuse and Martin Heidegger. I mentioned it here, that Marcuse was not able to finish his habilitations with Martin Heidegger, and it was not known that Marcuse and Heidegger had this exchange of letters till the archive was opened, and we could find this letter in the archive.
Sí, bueno, como parte de todos estos documentos que eran desconocidos en aquel momento, aparecieron las cartas de Marcuse con Heidegger, puesto que, bueno, Marcuse había querido hacer su habilitación con Heidegger y pues eso no sucedió, ¿verdad? Y bueno, es parte de todos estos documentos que hasta hace recientemente, en términos relativos, pues se dieron a conocer, ¿verdad?
And these letters were now published in Spanish, were translated from Romero, and we find these letters in an English translation. And it was very interesting to see that Marcuse's decision to join the Institute in 1933 was because he didn't see any chance to get a job or something at the university under the National Socialism system. So that it was the reason that he came to the Institute. But he never went into the Institute. He was never there in Frankfurt because he went from Freiburg to Geneva after that, very quickly.
Sí, bueno, pues que de este intercambio epistolar lo que se muestra es que Marcuse no tenía inicialmente la intención de trabajar en el Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales de Frankfurt, sino que pues fue un giro debido a la imposibilidad de obtener ese aval académico de Heidegger, ¿verdad? Y que pues entonces se unió al instituto, pero nunca trabajando en Frankfurt, sino desde otras ciudades. Y bueno, pronto después de de que se unió al instituto, pues llegó el nacionalsocialismo y de ahí pues él tuvo que exiliarse, ¿verdad? Ok, bueno, vamos a ver. ¿Qué más? Una pregunta de Pablo en el Facebook. Ok, en el chat. Ok. Ok, dice, me gustaría preguntar sobre los métodos de trabajo en el archivo que dirige, en el sentido de la investigación de la historia de las ideas, puesto que en nuestro contexto también se están realizando en este momento esfuerzos por trabajar en archivos, relecturas y en análisis de historia del pensamiento filosófico en Costa Rica. Gracias. Okay, this is a query from a colleague, Paulo Hernandez, and he wants to ask about the methods of analysis that you use in the archive that you are in charge of, in the sense of how does this affect, or what are some consequences of this research for the history of ideas, because it's a field that here in the philosophy department of the University of Costa Rica, we are developing currently, and so we are interested in how you see this archive work. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. The archive shows us a very detailed work and researches and analyses on the 1930s, 1940s. So it was not only the critical theory is not only the work from Adorno and Max Horkheimer, the dialectic of enlightenment. What the documents in the archive show now that this scientific community, which is called Frankfurt School or critical theory, has different kind of views, different kind of works. It was not a homogeneous group. They have different interests, and that is something new we can find in this in the archive. For example, individual and terror. Nobody knows that Leo Löwenthal, or only a small group, knew that Leo Löwenthal wrote about individual and terror. Most of them saw him before as a literature sociologist, for example. And now it changed a little bit. In the idea of in the history of history, we see now that Löwenthal did some research on the propaganda. Marcuse did some research on the National Socialism. Of course, Adorno and Horkheimer did it with the dialectic of enlightenment. And that means we see on one hand the different interests from the scientists of the Social Institute, but we see on the other hand that the main direction of the research were common interests. Common interests, but different ways to go to this common interest, to have access to this common interest. And that is very interesting. And we see it on the can see that on the documents in the archive. I know a long answer on that.
Sí, bueno, vamos a ver un poco y lo que se rompe con estas investigaciones más documentadas, más detalladas acerca de los investigadores de la Escuela de Frankfurt es la homogeneidad, ¿verdad? La idea de que estos autores estaban haciendo pues cosas muy compactas, muy en el mismo sentido, y más bien lo que se muestra es una diversidad, ¿verdad? Vamos a ver algunos temas en común, pero con detalles, con enfoques que son muchas veces distintos entre sí. Y pues bueno, lo que muestran entonces es que hablar de una escuela de Frankfurt o de un instituto de investigaciones sociales de la Universidad de Frankfurt, pues implica como entrar en mucho más detalles y mucho más matices que los que usualmente se supone o se presuponen que se dan en esta corriente, ¿verdad? Y eso es una cuestión que se ha dado gracias al estudio de este archivo ampliado pues con el que se cuenta a partir de los años 80.
And only want to add only a small comment. We see in the letters, for example, I just published the letters, it's a collection from letters between Löwenthal and Marcuse, and we see in the letters, for example, that in which piece people were working together. For example, when Marcuse was threatened by the Ku Klux Klan in 1968, Leo Löwenthal was hiding him in his private cabin in Carmel on the West Coast. And it was not known before that during this time when they were in this cabin, Löwenthal and Marcuse worked on two pieces which were published from Herbert Marcuse, Revolution and Revolt. And because of the letters, we can see, because Marcuse wrote, Leo, I'm very happy that you wrote my manuscript, and we can see which people from the Frankfurt School were working together and on which themes they were working together. And I think that's very interesting for the critical theory and the history of ideas.
Sí, un aspecto acá, un ejemplo también que señala el profesor Jansen es que a partir de estos intercambios epistolares se muestra cómo estaban trabajando en conjunto algunos autores de la Escuela de Frankfurt, y por ejemplo, bueno, cómo cuando Marcuse fue amenazado por el Ku Klux Klan en 1968, se refugió, se fue pues a proteger a una cabaña que tenía Löwenthal en la costa oeste, y ahí estuvieron pues intercambiando, vamos a ver, posiciones, dialogando, etcétera, y a partir de ese, digamos, de ese intercambio, de esa experiencia compartida, aparecieron dos artículos muy importantes, Revolución y Revuelta, de Marcuse, y por ahí algún otro que en este momento se me fue, pero digamos, es muy interesante en ese sentido, ¿verdad? Porque muestra entonces esas interacciones que había dentro del grupo de la Escuela de Frankfurt, ¿verdad? Más específicamente, quienes estaban compartiendo temáticas, quienes estaban dialogando entre sí para elaborar acerca de los temas de interés. Ok, vamos a ver por aquí en el chat. Pregunta, ok, ahora sí tenemos preguntas. Ok, pregunta de Rocío. Rocío Zamora, ¿podría ampliar su tesis sobre la función de la amistad entre ambos para la construcción de una utopía desde el exilio? Dice, could you elaborate on the role of friendship between the two, Marcuse and Löwenthal, in the construction of a notion of utopia from exile?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for that. You know, if you're going to exile, you don't know what happened with your life, and the only contact between people and to stay alive is to look for friends, and that is something that the utopian character means. It doesn't matter which kind of ideology or political interests you have. If you have common interests and you have a common interest against unsolidarity world, it's the most utopian character about this you can find in a friendship. Friendship is beyond all ideology, beyond ideology. And this idea of utopia means to create a world which is free from all ideology and political racism and so on. So that it means friendship is the concrete utopian concept to stay alive in exile. If you were threatened, for example, by right-wing groups or by National Socialism, like it was in 1930s, 1933, in the friendship, the concept of utopia gets concrete. And that is the reason why it called the friendship, or the lecture is called the friendship of utopia. You work together, you have contact together, you analyze the National Socialism together, you see the anti-Semitism together, you fight against this. And all this means you can only stay alive in exile if you have the support from your friends, emotionally and ideology and theoretically. And that means this concept of utopia.
Sí, el concepto de utopía está directamente vinculado con el tema de la amistad, ¿verdad? En el sentido de que la amistad es, bueno, en el caso específico que menciona, se refiere a la experiencia, digamos, a la necesidad de un apoyo en una comunidad en exilio, ¿verdad? Que no tiene otra cosa que ofrecerse entre sí, más que la amistad, ¿verdad? El apoyo. Pero además de eso, bueno, que de por sí la misma idea de amistad se encuentra más allá de las ideologías, digamos, que trasciende las ideologías, por una parte, y por otro lado, pues bueno, también que a partir de esta, digamos, de esta amistad común, eventualmente estos autores también logran formular sus posiciones, sus teorías respecto de todos estos problemas que tienen, de las persecuciones, de la estructura, de todas estas desigualdades, del autoritarismo, etcétera, ¿verdad? Entonces, bueno, pues principalmente en esos varios sentidos sería que tendría, digamos, una relación entre utopía, amistad y exilio, ¿verdad? Ok, pregunta de Jethro Macís. En español se ha publicado de Marcuse un breve texto sobre Marx y Heidegger, y en inglés existe también Heideggerian Marxism. ¿Conservó Marcuse en toda su obra algo así como una influencia de Heidegger? Al fin y al cabo, ¿qué fue de aquel marxismo con influencia de la filosofía de la existencia? ¿Tiene alguna actualidad o se trata solamente algo del pasado? Okay, yeah, well, this question from Jethro Macís, who is a Heideggerian, by the way. Yeah, he wants to know your assessment about how much from Heidegger did Marcuse keep in his later work, or if it was just something very temporary from his early formation.
Yeah, I mean, you find some tracks, you find something from Heidegger, for example, in the One-Dimensional Man. You see in a footnote, Marcuse mentioned the term Entwurf in a footnote, and of course that is a Heideggerian notion, a Heideggerian issue, but it was stronger in the 1920s, 1929s, when he was working with Heidegger. And I mean, Richard Wallen, a friend of the City University of New York, he wrote a book, it's called Heidegger's Children. And there he looked what was the interest, for example, from Hannah Arendt, from Günther Anders, from Hans Jonas, from Marcuse, what were the interests on the Heidegger Marxism. Okay, so the term Heidegger Marxism was a little bit too fast, in my opinion. The Marcuse's work was, every time it was influenced by 3 or 4 theoreticals. It was Heidegger, it was Lukács, it was Hegel, and it was Marx. And he uses these 3 or 4 theories to create something of the so-called existentialism, Heidegger existentialism. But you have to keep in mind, it was not only Heideggerian ideology or the Heideggerian theory. To make it short, yes, there are some expressions in the late works of Marcuse, but only a few, not very much. And I don't know if it's the interview between Fredrik Olafsson and Herbert Marcuse is translated into Spanish. It was an interview from 1978, and Fredrik Olafsson spoke with Herbert Marcuse about his Heidegger time, and there you can find some very interesting answers. What does it mean that Marcuse was interested in Heidegger theory? I mean, I think he was much more in the existentialism, much more close to Sartre than to Heidegger. But okay, that would be my answer. Still some tracks in the late books, but it's a distance. It's a distance from the 90s to before the 1930s.
Ok, sí. No, don't worry. Bueno, después de esta influencia más bien temprana en los años 20 y principios de los 30, en realidad se encuentra pocas menciones acerca de Heidegger. Por ejemplo, en el hombre unidimensional aparece pues ahí mencionado un concepto, el de Entwurf, que tiene una connotación muy cercana, ¿verdad?, a Heidegger, aunque no le es exclusiva. Más adelante, en una entrevista tardía, no recuerdo el nombre de la persona que lo entrevista, pero bueno, ya pues en las últimas épocas de Marcuse, él se extiende acerca de su relación con Heidegger y le parece al profesor Jansen que en realidad el existencialismo de Sartre le fue más cercano a Marcuse en su desarrollo más de madurez que la filosofía de Heidegger. Y por otro lado, señala que a lo largo de toda la producción de Marcuse hubo 4 autores importantes, ¿verdad? Que siempre tuvo como referencia que fueron Marx, Hegel, Lukács y Heidegger, en diferente medida, en diferentes momentos, ¿verdad? Pero que siempre fueron sus puntos de referencia. Entonces por ahí señala que le parece que sí se lanzó muy tempranamente, muy alegremente el término de marxismo heideggeriano, y que pues no, viéndolo con un poco más de detenimiento, pues que no es tan preciso, no es tan relevante. Bueno, una pregunta acá más logística, desde Sebastián Coto. Quiero preguntar sobre el acceso al archivo. ¿Hay material digitalizado? Saludos. He wants to know if the archive is open access.
Yeah,
okay.
Good question. Okay, that is what I want to mention at least. If you want to get access to the archive, it's a little bit tricky to get some information so that come into the archive. But if you need some help, don't hesitate to send me an email. So I can give you some links that you have, whoever wants to have it, who find very good access to the digital documents. So I don't know if you have my email address. You can share it with people who are interested in, and don't hesitate. And I give you some ways, some links that you can find it. On the other hand, just one point I want to mention: if you want to go to the Adorno archive in Berlin, it's very good organized. So you can go to the digital archive with Adorno. You find it on the internet too. But we want, in Frankfurt, we want to concentrate all the critical theories. Unfortunately, we can't do that with Adorno and Walter Benjamin, but now we have the Nachlass, what is Nachlass? The estate.
Obra póstuma, sí.
Yeah, from Jürgen Habermas. He's still alive. It's a Vorlass. And we also have it from Oskar Negt. We have it from Alfred Schmidt. We have it from Max Horkheimer. So that is our attempt to get all this documents from the critical theories. So again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to send me an email.
Ok, bueno, nos comentan todos que hay una iniciativa. Se ha tratado de unificar en un solo archivo todos los teóricos críticos clásicos, ¿verdad? Lamentablemente pues no será posible con los archivos de Adorno y de Benjamin, pero pues bueno, ya parece que en el caso de Habermas pues parece que sí se va a poder, y por ahí Oskar Negt. Entonces bueno, pues eso se encuentra en proceso. Respecto del acceso al archivo de Löwenthal y de Marcuse, dice el profesor Jansen que pueden escribirle su dirección de correo electrónico, pues la tiene el Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, ¿verdad? A ellos se les puede consultar por si alguien pues tiene interés en consultar este archivo.
And I worked with José Romero very close, and José Romero, he translated a lot of documents into Spanish, and he published 3 books on documents. So he get the document from our archive, and he translated a lot of pieces into Spanish.
Sí, también es importante señalar que hay mucho material nuevo de Marcuse, principalmente, que ha sido traducido por José Manuel Romero, ¿verdad? Entonces se encuentran en varias editoriales distintas en España. Ahora pues me percato también que en Colombia ha publicado alguna parte de estos textos. Entonces bueno, también es bueno tener esa referencia, ¿verdad? Ya textos publicados, traducidos al español por un especialista. Bueno, parece que no hay más preguntas. No sé si en el Facebook Live, ¿verdad? Pero acá en el Zoom, pues no. Entonces, ok. Bueno, entonces, pues estamos por ahora. Do you want to say some last?
Yeah, I want to say thank you very much that I had the chance. It was my first lecture in Latin America. I did some lectures in Brazil, and some pieces were translated in Portuguese. But in Spanish, I sent you the paper on from José Romero. Yeah. He translated a piece of mine, and so I'm very happy to have the chance to get it streamed. Unfortunately, I don't have students here. I see 2 students. Hi, very welcome. But of course, unfortunately, of the COVID situation, we have to use a new technology, which would be very interested to see this new technology compared with Marcuse's critique on technology. Maybe someone of you want to write a dissertation about it. I think it's very interesting to compare this critique on Marcuse with the new digitalization. So thank you very much, George, that you make it possible. And I wrote this piece together with my colleague Inka Engel. She's here, but I lectured it. So thank you, Inka, for supported me by this. Thanks. To support me by this piece, and I hope you get some interesting information about the lecture. Thank you for listening, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for the lecture. Bueno, el profesor agradece mucho que ustedes hayan estado acá, ¿verdad? Y bueno, toda la organización de la actividad, y pues bueno, también deja por ahí la inquietud acerca de cómo pensaría Marcuse toda esta problemática de la virtualidad y de la tecnología con estos tiempos del COVID, ¿verdad? Bueno, les agradecemos mucho. Muchas gracias.